In the winter of 1777, a place meant to shelter soldiers became their grave. Valley Forge, the name, often associated with hardship, but the horrible things that happened there goes far beyond the ordinary suffering of war. It's a memory that has been passed down generation after generation. But for those who lived it, there's one truth that no one talks about. What we faced there was not just the cold or the enemy. We battled something much darker and relentless. Valley Forge, it was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where soldiers could rest, regroup, and wait for the next push. What we didn't know, what we couldn't have known, was that this place was already scarred. The land had been bathed in blood, and it wasn't ready to give us peace. We arrived with some hope. We were worn out from the constant fighting, eager to rest. But the second we stepped foot on that land, we knew something was wrong. The cold hit us harder than we expected, not just in the air, but in our bones. And the huts, those so-called shelters, they were nothing more than ramshackle hovels, barely enough to protect us from the biting winds. As soon as we settled in, we realized this wasn't just a place to survive. It was a place that was slowly consuming us. From the very first night, the place felt wrong. It wasn't just the cold or the discomfort. There was a heaviness in the air, a suffocating feeling like the land had been tainted by death. And it wasn't long before strange things began to happen. The first morning, we woke up to find our gear moved. Rifles, blankets, even food, gone. Then came the cold. It wasn't the usual biting wind. It felt as though the cold was alive, creeping into every corner of the camp, making us feel trapped in it. Some of us thought it was just fatigue, but I knew better. Something about that place wouldn't let go of us. And that cold, it wasn't just outside, it was inside too. It clung to us, froze our thoughts. The nights were the worst. We didn't think much of it at first. We were soldiers, trained to endure. But the days dragged on, and as the winter deepened, something changed in all of us. We weren't just fighting the elements anymore. We were fighting something inside us, and it was slowly breaking us. We started hearing things, whispers in the night, footsteps when no one was near. And it wasn't just me who felt it. Every man in that camp felt it. The cold hit us harder than we ever imagined. It wasn't just the winter air, it was something suffocating about it. The freezing wind cut right through our thin coats, and the hunger, God, the hunger. Some days, we barely had enough to keep us going. Every day felt like a battle for survival. The physical toll was the worst of it. The frostbite came first, numbing fingers and toes until they were unrecognizable, blackened by the cold. Then came the hunger, gnawing at us from the inside out, making us weaker by the day. Some men started to lose the will to move. Some couldn't even speak anymore. They just stared into nothing, their minds as frozen as their limbs. As if the elements weren't enough, there was the ever-present tension. We had been trained to face the enemy head-on, but here, we were at the mercy of something we couldn't fight off. It was the bitter cold, the hunger, the diseases, things that didn't care who we were, didn't care about our weapons. Out here, the environment itself was as deadly as any enemy force. We thought we could endure. We thought the worst had already come. But as the days dragged on, the frustration set in. We weren't making any progress. No food, no reinforcements. It felt like we were just waiting to die, one slow, painful day at a time. I can't even describe the feeling of watching men wither away right in front of you, helpless to do anything. Our supplies ran out faster than we could replace them, and the misery, it just kept growing. Then came the sickness. Fever swept through the camp like wildfire. Men were too weak to stand, too ill to work, and the diseases only spread faster. Dysentery, smallpox. By the time we had any kind of medical aid, it was too late. The wounded couldn't be treated, and the sick were left to suffer alone, their cries echoing through the cold night. The first deaths weren't from enemy fire. They came from the cold, the diseases. Men we'd fought beside for months were suddenly gone, their bodies frozen in the same positions they had fought in. No one said anything, but we all knew. Some of us were next. By the time the first bodies were carried away, we realized something more than our bodies was breaking. The camp, the cold, the sickness, it was eroding our very spirits. And it wasn't just us. The men who made it through, who didn't die from the cold, were haunted by something we couldn't explain. And as the days passed, we all started to wonder, would we ever leave here? Or was Valley Forge meant to be our final resting place? We weren't prepared for what this place would do to us. The physical suffering was bad enough, but it wasn't the worst. The worst was how the fear crept into our minds. We stopped sleeping. The cold and hunger gnawed at us, but it was the waiting that drove us to madness. Days blurred together. Time stopped making sense. The physical toll was easy to see. Men losing fingers and toes to frostbite, others too weak to even lift a rifle. But what we couldn't see, what we didn't understand, was how the cold started eating at our minds. Strong men I had fought beside, began to crumble. Their eyes lost that spark. They started talking to themselves, saying things that made no sense. The fear wasn't just in their bones, it was in their heads. One soldier started saying the enemy was among us, already here, watching us. It wasn't just the cold, the strange sounds, the things we couldn't explain. We'd hear footsteps outside, but when we'd open the door, there was no one there. I remember one night hearing a gunshot. It was so real, I jumped up and grabbed my rifle. But when I went outside, everything was still. And then, there were the voices. Whispers in the snow. Voices calling out in the distance, like the enemy was closing in on us, except no one ever showed up. Some nights, I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. The whole camp would fall silent. Then there would be a noise. A loud bang, like something heavy falling, or a voice calling in the distance. But when we investigated, there was nothing. Nothing except the snow and the cold. And every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it again, clearer than before. A gunshot, a scream, footsteps in the snow. Some of the men began to say we were being haunted by the dead. They started to speak of ghosts, men who had died here in the camp, their souls trapped in the cold, unwilling to leave. They said they could see them in the dark corners, in the snow, but no one really believed it. Not at first. Not until the night we found one of our own standing in the middle of the camp, staring into the distance, talking to someone we couldn't see. We didn't know what to think anymore. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was the hunger, or maybe it was something we couldn't explain. But one by one, we started to break. Some men started to scream in their sleep. Some would talk about things we couldn't understand. And then there was Carter. He was always the strongest, the bravest. But one night, he disappeared. Just like that. No sign of struggle. No tracks. Gone. I knew we weren't alone out there, but I didn't think something like this could happen. We never found Carter. He wasn't the first to disappear, and he wouldn't be the last. There were others, men who just vanished into the night, swallowed up by the cold, by the madness, by whatever was stalking us. And now, even years later, I still wonder, was it the war that broke us, or was it something darker that was already waiting for us there, in the shadows? When the food ran out, we thought it couldn't get worse. But when it did, it wasn't the cold or the hunger anymore. It was the despair. We didn't just feel lost in the snow, we felt lost in time, like the world had moved on and left us behind. We were hungry, but it wasn't our bodies starving, it was our spirits. The longer we went without food, the less we cared. Our will to survive, to fight, faded away. When there was food, we didn't even want it anymore. It wasn't about hunger, it was about a slow decay, something inside of us that was dying, even if our bodies weren't. Men started to change. The hunger twisted them. They became shadows of the men they once were, lost in thought, distant, unrecognizable. We began to avoid looking at each other. Every day felt like a countdown to the next breakdown. The despair was the worst part. It was all-consuming, and it never let go. The realization that there was no end was driving everyone insane. We'd see men in the morning, and by evening they were gone. Some didn't make it through the night. Some chose the cold, the frozen earth, as their final bed. The first time we found one of our own. He wasn't the first to go, but he was the first to make that decision. We all saw it coming, but none of us could stop it. When we found him, his body was cold, just like everything else. No one spoke. We couldn't. What was there to say? The grief, it was like a weight on all of us, pressing down. But we couldn't talk about it, not then. We just kept moving forward, doing what we had to do to survive. The days blurred together after that. I couldn't tell when the night ended and the morning began. It was as though time itself had stopped. The The frozen landscape outside was endless, a mirror to the emptiness inside of us. The bodies started piling up, those who died from the cold, from starvation, from madness. We buried them, but the weight of it all stayed with us. The more we buried, the more we felt ourselves slipping away. No one spoke about it. Not then, not ever. We were all broken in different ways, but none of us could admit it. It was a death we couldn't face, not from the enemy, but from ourselves, from the land, from the cold. Some of us didn't make it out, and those of us who did, we never spoke of it again. We had heard rumors of a resupply mission, of reinforcements, but nothing could prepare us for what happened when they arrived. Some of us saw them as saviors, but others, after all we had been through, couldn't look at anyone the same. We knew what it was to suffer, to feel death just waiting for us. We couldn't trust anyone anymore. The arrival of supplies brought a brief flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the paranoia that had set in. The food, the ammunition, the new recruits, they were supposed to help, but none of us could look at them without wondering if they were the same. Some thought the supplies might be poisoned, others feared that the new men didn't belong here. After everything we had seen, trust had become a foreign concept. Every face we saw seemed like a potential threat. For a brief moment, we felt something we hadn't felt in what seemed like years: purpose. We got new orders, new ammunition, and new men to lead. But even as we tried to move forward, we couldn't shake the mental weight of everything that had happened. We were too far gone. The hunger, the cold, the deaths. There was no way to come back from that. The sense of purpose was fleeting. In the end, it was just another distraction, another attempt to force our minds back to something we could control. It was as if we had crossed a point of no return. The battle wasn't just about survival anymore. We were in a haze, fighting as though the enemy wasn't the only thing we were fighting. It was the camp, the cold, the memories, the madness that had already claimed so many of us. And yet we still moved forward, in a daze, as if the war had taken on a life of its own. Hunger twisted our minds, and despair fueled our desperation. There was no reason left, just the impulse to push forward, hoping for something, anything to end the suffering. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting to escape the madness that had infected every part of us. It was no longer about the enemy on the battlefield. It was about getting away from the camp, the cold, the death that surrounded us. Every soldier fought with a ferocity that came from the deepest places within us, not just to survive the battle, but to escape the trap that had closed around us. And then there were the moments when I couldn't tell if we were still at war or if it had all ended and we were already dead. The war wasn't just on the front lines. It was in our heads. It was in our eyes. The faces of the men we lost haunted us. The memories of the cold, the hunger, the fear, those things stayed with us long after the fighting had stopped. I'll never forget the way the men looked at me, their eyes empty, their minds already lost to the madness we'd all been through. Spring didn't come all at once. It was slow. And when it did, we didn't feel the freedom we thought we'd have. It wasn't the season that broke the ice. It was the men who made it through. But for those who did, nothing was the same. We had made it through the hell of Valley Forge, but we were forever changed. Spring's arrival should have brought hope, but it didn't. It wasn't the warmth or the sun that had us looking for solace. It was the memories that thawed with the earth. Those who didn't make it, they were never far. Their faces, their voices, they stayed with us. And there wasn't a single man who could forget what he'd seen, what he'd lost. I left Valley Forge, but Valley Forge never left me. The war didn't end with the last gunshot. It ended with every man who had to survive it. The battles continued long after the smoke had cleared. The war didn't end with the last shot, and neither did the suffering. We were never the same. Some of us couldn't even remember what life was like before the war. The battles, they didn't just happen on the battlefield. They were inside us, tearing us apart piece by piece, and some of us never came back from Valley Forge. Some of us could never return. Some were broken beyond repair. We thought we were going home. We thought we could leave it behind, but the war was never done with us. And Valley Forge was never done with me. It stayed with me, in my dreams, in my waking hours. The faces of those we lost. It haunted me. It haunted all of us. The war didn't just change the course of history, it changed us. Every man who survived Valley Forge carried it with him. The war didn't just end when the fighting stopped. It continued, festering in our minds, in our bodies, in the ways we tried to rebuild lives that could never be rebuilt. Some say time heals all wounds, but there are wounds that no time can erase. We survived Valley Forge, but the true cost of that survival is something that follows us long after the battles are done. And it doesn't end when the war ends. It ends when we no longer carry the weight of it. We tell the stories of victory, of glory, of battles won. But there are other stories, hidden in the cold, in the dark corners of camps like Valley Forge, that never make the headlines. Those are the stories of survival at any cost. The story of men who gave up their futures just to make it through the night. And in the end, when the war was over, we were left with the wreckage. Survival came with a price, one that many of us didn't even realize we were paying until much later. The war took more than lives. It took pieces of us. Those of us who made it through, we carried something far heavier than any weapon or uniform. It's the weight of the silence, the faces of the fallen, the sounds of a battle that never really ends. When the war was over, it didn't stop. We were left with ourselves, but the men we were before the war, they were gone. Some of us never spoke about what happened there. There are things a man can't say, things that linger too deep. It's not just the bloodshed or the battles fought. It's the unseen toll, the minds broken, the souls cracked open by what we were forced to do to survive. You can make it through a war, but the real cost is what happens to you after. How do you go back? How do you return to a world that doesn't understand? We didn't come back the same. The war left us like ghosts. The battlefields may be forgotten, the war may have ended, but it's the scars we carry with us that remain. The real fight, the one that no one talks about, is the one we face when we get home. It's the battle against the silence, against the memories that won't fade. Those of us who survived don't talk about the war, but it's always there. It's in the way we look at the world, in the way we move through life, always carrying the weight of those days. We fought in the war, but the real fight was after the war, when we were left to pick up the pieces. We left Valley Forge with our bodies intact, but what about our souls? We carry the legacy of survival, of pushing through unimaginable hardships, but at what cost? For some, the memories fade with time. For others, they never fade at all. We can never forget what we went through. We can never escape it. There's no grand conclusion, no easy end. The war ended, but the legacy it left behind continues. We survived, but the war never truly left us. The winter at Valley Forge was just the beginning. The real battle, the one we face every day, has no end, no victor. It's the fight to carry on, to keep moving, even when the weight of it all is more than you can bear.